this is probably the most significant financial event most people will go through in their lives. And it's too important for somebody not to walk through it with someone else. And we really felt that there was a great need to be served in that respect. And so that's what we've been doing since 2023.
Welcome to Season 3 of the Ophthalmology Experience, powered by Boost Patients. Today, we're joined by Mike Guelcher. Mike is a co-founder of Prism Consulting Partners, a firm focused on advising eye care practices through the sale process. He and his team work closely with doctors to navigate transactions, partnerships, and exit planning. He brings a unique perspective to the space, having been involved in hundreds of transactions and multiple recapitalizations within one of the fastest growing optometry groups in the country. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Guido.
That's a lot of transactions to be a part of. So really interesting to kind of hear what you have to say. I'm just curious, just to get started, to give the audience just a little bit more background. Can you share a little bit more about those transactions, kind of who you are and how you got into this space?
Yeah, I mean the brief part, the brief way of how I got into the space was probably like how many of us did. Somebody believed in us at one point and took a chance on us, and here we are. Most people don't typically leave eye care. I think a lot of people stick around. So I got in 2003 when Allergan was a very small eye care company, probably known more for Botox than for eye care at the time. Went through different roles of increasing responsibility over about a decade. And then in 2014, got my first exposure to private equity backed eye care groups and was recruited by one of those to help with their expansion effort, and had a really wonderful 8-year experience there, learning a lot, being around some really, great, really smart, really terrific people, and helped an organization grow from, at the time, what was 70 offices to 850. I was part of a small team that did that, and learned a lot along the way. So it was a really terrific experience. And then at the end of 2022, started 2023, founded Prism with my now current partner, and have had a really great experience being an external advisor to people in this process, because I think one of the things we learned over time was just this is probably the most significant financial event most people will go through in their lives. And it's too important for somebody not to walk through it with someone else. And we really felt that there was a great need to be served in that respect. And so that's what we've been doing since 2023.
Yeah, that's a great I- a great summary, I think, of what I was trying to ask, or what I was thinking about asking, which is why did you kind of switch perspectives? You must have seen a lot of things that maybe as a lack of resources or a lack of just perspective from the provider side, that you saw an opportunity to say, let's let's help some of these providers go through this big event in their lives. So what were some of the reasons why you decided to kind of change and become an external advisor? What were some of the things that you were seeing?
In large part, for people that build really successful businesses, they don't get a blueprint when they graduate that directs you how to do that. Everybody has their own set of experiences and their own formative events that they go through in the growing of any practice, whether they started it 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or even just 5 or 10 years ago. Um, so I think some of the things that we saw were just a lot of people coming from the perspective of, I just don't know what I should be asking. I don't know what I should be looking for. I don't know how I best, get ready for something like this. And I think one of the things um, that was always challenging was being able to help somebody figure out when the right time was. And because there's so much of a economic and emotional consideration, and those two don't always run in parallel. So I think being able to give somebody the tools and the outlet to um, a third party that can objectively look at this from the outside um, carried value. Now, obviously, we had to put ourselves out there to the test to see if that concept in fact did, but we felt like we learned enough that looking at things from a buyer's perspective and having to, frankly, compete against other buyers allowed us to have a very good feel for the ecosystem and to really help us help clients align to strategies that, from a transition perspective, made the most sense for them, for their life, for their goals. They ultimately define when to make the step, but the way we will put it with our clients is that you've identified your point A. It's our job to just get you to your point B as advantageously as possible. And that means turning over every opportunity. Fortunately, my partner and I have been in the space for a while. So that was conducive for reestablishing and building up relationships that were already there. Because sometimes when you're starting out new, that can be very, very
Sure.
difficult. But we found the concepts to be very transferable and a lot of learnings to be transferable. And I think our clients have seen a lot of value in that.
And as far as the discovery process, I'm sure that there's a when you start talking to a practice or a provider that is looking into potentially making a sale, that there's some bit of information gathering that you all do. You ever talk to a doctor and after that process, you're like, you know what? I don't know if a sale is the right thing for you to do right now. And what if that's true? What are some of the reasons why that might be?
Yeah, it's a good question and a good point. It's very common for us to have initial conversations with people, what I call are just further upstream. Um, they're not at a place where they're necessarily ready mentally or otherwise, but they need to know who to connect to have some of those initial conversations. It may be that they've taken on a lot of practice debt recently. They might be in a growth phase where they've just brought on an associate provider. We know in the initial years, um, it's a lot of times a short-term hit for a long-term gain, to put it very broadly. That process takes time. And I think, exit readiness is not just um, a financial waypoint. There's a psychological waypoint that you have to achieve as well, which is when you start to think about questions like, how do I envision my life after the sale of a practice? I mean, this is a significant event. So for many people whose identities are very entrenched in these businesses, and rightfully so, they've built them up over a long period of time. You have to have both the economic and the psychological conversations because I think we carry our lives to work every day. It's not a work-life balance. That's an oxymoron. It's integrated. So both of those aspects have to be addressed early on up front. And when we find and hear certain things based on the pattern recognition of having been through it hundreds of times, you start to pull out some of those different, whether it's a comment you hear or something around, yeah, I just got to get this associate up to speed or whatever it might be. Those things can often trigger a deeper dive into some of those considerations.
Yeah. And I think you said the psychological part, and that's kind of what I've been wondering too, because initially the buyer comes in and starts talking about valuations and multiples and here's how much you could financially gain from this transaction and I'm sure that's very attractive up front to the doctor,
Sure.
but from a long-term perspective as you're advising your clients, like how do you get them to a point where when the shininess of, well, I don't know, depending on the multiple, maybe the shininess never wears off of whatever that financial piece is. But,
Sure.
a few years into the transaction that they're still happy that they did this deal.
Yeah. Look, it's a terrific question. And, one of the things that's interesting about the ecosystem and the chessboard of PE is you have all these organizations, optometry, ophthalmology, and other subspecialties that are at different points in their life cycle. So you're joining some larger ecosystem at a given point in time, and it's a dynamic organization. It's ever changing. So when you talk about how do I know that I'm going to be happy with life 3 or 4 years from now, To be fair, you couldn't make that statement when you were in practice on your own either, because it's hard to predict the future either way. But I think one of the things that we can do, and this is usually a deeper dive into each individual buyer as we talk about and evaluate each alternative, is A, to know where they are in their life cycle. B, do you know some of the existing strands of DNA, so to speak? In other words, the practices that make up that patchwork quilt that is their group. Um, and C, to talk to the people themselves. I think there's never a substitute for having experience going through something like this, as you alluded to before we jumped on the call. So that part becomes really meaningful when you're a little bit further down the road and you're saying, okay, this has the potential to work. Who can I talk with that's been through this process? Who can I talk with that's come out the other side? Because the nice part about considering this alternative is that it's well beyond the stage of experimental, or you wouldn't see these groups recapitalizing and having some success, financial and otherwise. So um, that's kind of the approach we would take, is just making sure that when we've identified with them what seem to be the most viable options, now we begin to sort of strip back a little bit further and dig a little deeper into each of those opportunities so they have more clarity into what they'd be walking into, at least to the best extent you can, before signing an LOI and going through the process.
Quick break brought to you by Boost Patients. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a physician, a practice admin, or maybe someone on the marketing team, and you really have a singular goal. You want new patients, more consults, higher surgery volume. And oftentimes when you want that, you think immediately about marketing, spending more on marketing, investing more in marketing. Maybe, but probably not. We've mystery shopped over 600 practices, and there's one commonality with all of them. They're not very effective and not very good at patient follow-up. So before you invest more money in marketing and more into that investment, you really need to understand how your practice is following up with new patients. So go to boostpatients.com, fill out the contact us form, and let me know that you want us to mystery shop your practice. We'll mystery shop it. We'll document how your practice follows up with your new patient lanes, and we'll share that information with you. Now back to the show.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sure that from your perspective, from the buyer's side, and now on the consulting side,
Yeah.
you've seen a lot of things that make a transaction work, and probably some things that don't. What are, just maybe at a high level, for the ones that you've seen, or deal in process, let's say, what are some of the things that don't have a deal not work as well, from a that you've seen maybe providers making mistakes on?
Yeah. So I think a couple things. One is just simply, if you're walking into it with simply, if it's just strictly financial, right? Like if it's just strictly financial and you're just going for the most amount of money. I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but that mindset and that approach is going to leave other aspects of this unaddressed. So if somebody's walking into it with not a lot of open mindedness, if they need their pencils in the drawer a certain way or whatever it might be, that's going to make for probably a pretty challenging partnership. Because, and that's how they have to look at this if they're truly invested in wanting the practice to live on and be successful, which they all are, of course. But I think from a go forward perspective, you want open mindedness walking in. You want a curiosity. You want you want an understanding that, to their credit, they've been able to build and grow and nurture a business that's been able to reach a certain threshold. Yet there always comes a point when something outgrows all of us.
Right.
And at that stage, you have to make a decision who becomes the next steward to carry on what's been built. That transition is your responsibility. So it's almost like we say to many doctors, congratulations, you become a victim of your own success. And so now what happens is, what does the next evolution of that look like? And the good news is, when they're able to divest, when they're able to sell and take some of that future risk off the table, they're able to put that into the hands of groups who are now at stages where they're typically more evolved. They've probably been through some learnings themselves. And I think what you always have seen from the beginning of time is that constant push and pull of making a lot of acquisitions, holding back to make sure we're integrating properly, and that constant ebb and flow of group growth where they look back on a year and say, maybe we bit off a little more than we can chew.
Mhm.
Okay, let's pump the brakes, let's get this right, and then keep moving forward. I don't know that that pattern ever probably changes as long as there's investment capital coming into the healthcare space. But I think being able to speak with doctors in really detailed context about what we experienced and went through ourselves just adds a dimension of perspective to a conversation that I think they all appreciate.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, I'm thinking of really it's just a part of what any doctor or person should do, which is plan for the future.
Yeah.
And it's a you can call it exit strategy, you can call it uh, planning for how I want to live the last part of my career or whatever that is. And a lot of people don't like to think about that. None of us want to buy life insurance because we don't want to think about, but we're all going to die, or we're all going to get to that point, or we're all going to get towards the end of our career. Maybe I should have said those things next to each other, because it's not dying, but it's realizing where you want to go and how you want to leave your legacy to whomever or whatever that's going to be, whether it be the next doctor or making a sale. But it should be part of that conversation. So do you see yourself as kind of helping doctors think through whatever that it is for them, an exit strategy?
Yes, and to your point, it should be. When you start to think about this, and I guess the way I would ask, folks who listen to this to consider this is almost generationally. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But when you start to think about building a business over 20, 30, 40 years, um, that can occupy a very significant part of your identity. Um, how
Absolutely. It is
how
their identity.
much how much is not for me to say.
Yeah.
Um, but the other piece of this is most doctors, most generations that are going through this are also wearing other hats in their life. Their parents, their caregivers in some cases. Um, they might be active in their community on other boards. There may be other hats that they wear as part of their broader identity and what they do. So when you start to look at exit readiness and openness to exiting, it's interesting that some of the most recent research around exit planning and exit strategy planning suggests that the younger generations are actually more open to this than the older generations. We can all have our theories as to why, but I think as a Gen Xer myself, I sit in a very interesting cross section between the baby boomers that came before me and the millennials that are coming behind me. And what you begin to see is that this generation that's preceded me very much had work ethic on a pedestal. And they very much are about showing up and doing whatever it took, even if it meant working extra hours.
Yeah.
And not every generation has that same orientation. I'm not placing a value judgment on it either way,
Yeah.
but it's just been a very interesting dynamic to watch unfold as we've worked with clients. And when I say, how do you think about your exit in life after a sale? Those answers are all over the board, but some of the trends are very, very eye opening.
Yeah, that's really interesting you say that, because I definitely think there's a component of the age gap in the different values that people hold, in terms of the doctors that started doing this that are either boomers or now that are coming to the end half of their career. There isn't the identity is I work until I can't lift my hands anymore.
Yeah.
And I think the younger docs are probably a little more thinking about their future and have different ways they want to spend their time with. And
Yep.
maybe it's not that same thought of I'm gonna keep going until I physically can't do it anymore. There's likely a little difference. So if you're a younger doctor and you're thinking about ownership, like how should younger doctors be thinking about ownership, especially with the landscape that is changing in the PE landscape? So what do you think?
It's an interesting question because as you can attest to, I mean, the landscape's different than it just was a decade ago.
Sure.
And I'm confident that we won't be looking at the same landscape 10 years from now. It'll continue to evolve. So if you're looking at ownership, and I just had the privilege of addressing a group that's coming out into practice or is 5 to 10 years in recent weeks. And I said, probably resiliency and agility are the two best skills you can have when you're going to come out and take on ownership, because you're never going to have everything figured out. So the first thing I say is don't do it alone, right? Don't do it by yourself. Um, have somebody that you can turn to, whether it's an advisor or somebody that you have that can provide a detached perspective. That's always helpful really in all facets of life, but certainly with this. So that would be number one. Number two, um, be prepared to play the long game. It's not going to be a short term, it's not going to be short term success. You're doing this to build something, and that's going to take time. And usually, most good things take more time than you often think they do. So do not you get to 2 or 3 years into it and just know that there's more to be gained and more to be learned, and you'll have that experience to hopefully encourage somebody else who's walking 4 or 5 years behind you. Because I don't think that private practice as we know it, I think will continue to be around. I don't think it's going anywhere. I do think it's going to continue to have to evolve to be successful, but that's really not any different than before, even before private equity. I mean,
Right.
nobody's running it the same that they were 40 years ago or 30 or 20 or 10. So I guess to sum it up, resiliency, agility, don't do it by yourself, and be prepared to accept that things take time and oftentimes longer than you think it does.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I guess on the flip side, if there's someone who is maybe a few years away and they're making a consideration if this is the right move for them, what would be your advice to them, or what's a good first step?
I think if you can talk to those who have walked the path ahead of you, I think that gaining their experience and what they went through um, is highly meaningful. I still believe that you can chat GPT and AI everything you want, and all those things are valuable resources and tools. Until you've walked through it and been through it yourself, it's hard to replicate that. But I think you can use both resources and tools to help calibrate and guide, what steps you take. Um, I've always found that before making any important decision, don't do it hastily, gain input, um, but don't let perfection be the enemy of good either.
Right.
Most times, taking that first step just means taking it and knowing that others have done it. You won't be the first, probably won't be the last, and there's good people in this industry that can help. And there's a reason I think, I mentioned at the onset with eyecare, there's a lot of great people who have been in this industry for a long time, one of whom took a chance on me in 2003. They're still here. So I think those people saw something that was really cool. And I think this field continues to be really cool. And I think a lot of people are very committed and open to being resources to other people and helping see one another succeed. It helps everybody when that happens.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Getting as much as information as possible is critical. So working with someone like yourself that has the perspective and the experience doing multiple deals from both sides sounds like it'd be super helpful. So anyone listening that's considering it, and definitely do your research. Maybe talk to Mike, talk to somebody, get some help, and don't jump into it. I appreciate all your comments, because I told you we had a guest, but last week, similar topic. This isn't going anywhere. It's part of our healthcare landscape now,
Right.
and I appreciate the work that you're doing to help on the provider side now, because I'm biased. I've worked for providers to support providers, and I think they need all the help that they can get from the business side. So thank you very much for your help.
Oh, our pleasure. And yeah, nobody does it alone, and you can't. Not as the environment, especially as the environment gets more complex.
Absolutely. Um, awesome. Well, thanks again, Mike, for joining us. And also want to take a moment to thank the listeners for listening today. Don't forget to subscribe and share us with your friends on social media. Another shout out to Boost Patients for producing the podcast. Boost helps ophthalmology practices get more new patients without spending a dime on marketing. You can learn more about them at their website at boostpatients.com or check out the show notes. Until next time, have a great week.